about building relationships with people and talking with them and frequently I figure out which scientists I can trust. Because I have to figure out, because I've got some scientists who are really pushy and they're like, I want to get my study out there. And I'm like, no, it's not a breakthrough and or whatever. And I know which journalists, and I establish relationships with journalists so that they trust me or they trust people in my institution by talking on the phone or email or chatting or whatever, and just going back and forth. It's just building relationships.
I do think the issue of press releases is quite a big one though, and we have Nick Davis at our university. I don't know if anybody's read his book, Flat Earth News. I would highly recommend it to you. It's called Flat Earth News and it's written by a guy called Nick Davies, and it's a really important book because it talks about where we have come as journalists, and I think it applies to every aspect of journalism where we fail to do journalism now. What we do is we sit at our desks as journalists and we take press releases, and sometimes we don't even make the other call to the other source, and we just churn out what press release officers are saying. And it's not knocking what your press release officers are doing, because that's your job. But I think journalism is a slightly different job, and it's not just to get the press releases on the desk. And I always encourage my students when I'm teaching them and when I'm working professionally not to look at press releases, to go look at the paper. So we teach people how to read the papers, the scientific papers. We teach them how to get the information out there. And once you teach them how to do that, what I find is that they can go and they can find new and different kind of stories, other than the one that have been pre-selected by universities and pre-selected by the big journals, because actually there may be more interesting stories there. So I want to carry on talking for the next few minutes, but we're kind of want to keep hearing from you guys as well, and I've put a few questions there. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to go back to the issue of citations and retractions, if I can for a second. So I'm from Crossref, and one of the things that we're really worried about these days is trust in scholarly publishing, and so we're actually hoping to do something about this where you would actually have a mark on scholarly paper that's stewarded by the publisher so that you can say, this has been retracted, this has been corrected, this is fine the way it is. And the actual number of retractions is tiny, really, in the grand scheme of peer-reviewed literature. But when they hit, they're really devastating for the researcher and for the journal and for the scientific community. So it is one thing that we're really focused on. And, I hope to get scientists sort of excited about that idea that most of the time there's nothing to see here, but sometimes it's really important.
Well, we at PLOS are working on that, adding all that data on each paper, comments and ratings and citations and trackbacks to blog posts. So you open up a paper, you get everything that the online ecosystem has ever said about that paper. And you can then dig through that and then figure out, from the citations and all that commentary, is this a good paper, is it a bad paper, is it a retracted paper? So we hope that more and more journals are going to adopt those strategies, which are really going to be helpful for later readers and for science journalists as well as other scientists. All this stuff that is usually the lore of the lab, that was a bad paper, that you learn from your PI, nobody else knows. It's now going to become public knowledge. But what I really wanted to go is kind of this cycle, but let's imagine a scenario where you have a young, excited researcher and a young, excited journalist like Christine. One interviewing the other about the latest paper that was published, and they come all excited about each other and discuss and whatnot. And let's say that the final thing has a factual error. Christine made an error. Christine is trained as a journalist, not as a scientist. She got something wrong. That happens. That's fine. Especially early in the career, it's easy to make such mistakes. They're exchanging angry emails now with each other. Each one of them has lost a little bit of trust in the other medium. Next time around, both of them are going to be a little bit more guarded. If such a mistake happens again, next time they're going to be even more guarded. And now we have a whole generation of scientists who don't trust the journalists and don't want to talk to a journalist. And the same way, we have a whole generation of journalists who don't trust any scientists. How do we break that?
Interesting question.
Go ahead. Do you want to respond to
I'm from Nature, and I've written press releases, and I've done news, and I've been both sides of the microphone for interviewing. And I looked at that science news cycle, and who is to blame for the lack of public trust in science, journalists or scientists? It's neither. It's the news editors. It's the people who are gatekeepers
Me.
of what is
Nature.
I remember when I was working at the BBC World Service in the science unit, this was in the days when we used to still cut tape with razor blades, and the editor of the science unit said, "We want you to pitch your stories to the World News Desk. It'd get us maximum kudos, it would get us recognised, to show we're doing our job." So if I had a good story and I would pitch it to the news desk, and they'd say, and the news editor would say, "What's the conclusion of this, yes or no?" But in science stories, it's maybe, and it depends. And news editors don't like that. They want something that can fit in 25 seconds without any attributions. And therefore, you get the kind of illusion you've had, a low significance correlation becomes a causation. And that's how it happens. It's the news editors who are the demons and devils. Feel out of town.
I think that's partly true, anyway. I think that is a big part of it, and many science journalists, particularly in the UK,
But the standard of science journalism in the UK has improved immeasurably
and that's right. And
in the
what's
last
happening
20
is
years.
that a lot of the editors are using their science journalists as their specialists.
As cannon fodder.
No, I disagree. And they're saying, actually, is this reasonable, what we're saying here? And it's become more like that because of the number of errors that have been recently. So I think there is, without wanting to defend editors, and when I sat in a committee recently where we were talking about this thing in Britain, and all the editors were there, and the television people and the radio people, and there is an enormous will now for them to liaise more with their science journalists because they realise they have the specialism. And actually the more frightening thing I think that's happening in America is that your news organisations are all firing you, and who is going to help them make these kind of judgments? But I think in the UK, from where we sit, it's a slightly different scenario. We haven't really done Bora's question and debate yet, but
I still want to know who you can trust. Where do we go to get this information that we can trust?
Okay. People want to comment on
We,
that?
as a journalist, where do we go? Who do we talk to?
Okay.
I was going to kind of answer that, but go through, if you take why the editors do that, they'll blame the public. And then, it's the cycle that keeps going around. And Bora's question is, the journalists and the scientists, why don't they trust each other? I think the answer is in this room. It's the people here who put their blogging out there all the time so that you're not focused on one pinpoint interaction, that you can go back and see an archive of everything this person has written. You can get to know them in your daily news diet. Like, you're no longer reading The Guardian every day, you're reading an RSS feed of all of your blogs that come from all these different voices, and that interaction spreads out. And I think that this cycle could just be replaced by that constant and growing interaction where a mistake isn't catastrophic, where a mistake is fixed and a retraction is printed, and that relationship actually grows stronger because, like, hey, I just called them up and you fixed it, I appreciate that. Everyone knows immediately. So I feel like Science Online is really kind of answering some of these questions by just the interactions that we're all trying every day, which is different than the cycle completely different.
Okay, there's another
Yeah,
person.
I'm going to follow up on that. I mean, the answer to all these questions is you gotta do your work. And there's no shortcut to developing relationships. There's no shortcut to talking to enough people. You have to just keep talking to more and more and more people, and eventually you'll figure out who to trust. I mean, there's no technological fix, although it's nice to have all this internet technology to allow us to communicate, but you actually have to communicate. I mean, too many bloggers just sit back and they write, and so it's really just a one-way affair for them. And I mean, I use my blog to